Go on. Oh. Good. Oh god! Can't really see out of this thing. Got that? Go on. And then. Oh god! He's huge. Bonk. I really like. What? I'll just speed it up. Nailed it. Perfect, yeah. Shocking twist, everyone. That extremely competent and handsome Sith Lord that you saw earlier, it was me. It was me all along. That's right. Yeah, this is just my Halloween costume, and I thought, well, okay, the party I'm going to is video game themed. I was planning to do a video about KOTOR. Why not just, you know, do this? So I hope you all enjoyed that little bit of fun. We had a little bit of fun to start the video, but I hope you enjoyed that. And well, those of you who look at the community tab, you will have probably seen this coming, but. Yeah, it's a great costume. I'm kind of sewn into this, so we're just gonna kind of power through, but without the Revan mask, because that thing, it gets steamed up. So we're just gonna carry on, but without the Revan mask attached. Let me ask you a question. Do you remember that scene in Star Wars? When I asked this question, you probably thought of a particular scene that you think that I mean by that. Maybe it's a scene that was dramatic, or one that was cool, or one that was unintentionally hilarious, or really bad, or maybe one that was the coolest thing you'd ever seen at 5 years old. In fact, before I reveal what scene I mean, tell me in the comments which scene you thought of when I asked that question. As I'm sure you're going to demonstrate, Star Wars is full of memorable moments, and these moments leave an impression on us, for better or for worse. Then there are scenes that really take you a minute to remember, and the scene I want us to think about is one of those. It's that scene where Luke goes out looking for R2 and ends up getting a good old bashing from the Tusken Raiders. I want us to just ask this question. Why did the Tusken Raiders attack Luke? Just from what's presented to us in the film. The obvious answer is it's a plot contrivance to introduce Obi-Wan, and it suits the narrative structure for Luke to be relatively easily overcome early in his hero's journey. We get to meet his mentor, who can startle the Tusken Raiders, and Luke has room to grow from getting knocked out by some nameless, faceless guy to blowing up the Death Star. When we're watching this scene, our best guess is they wanted his speeder, right? They were obviously going to steal his speeder, which is fair enough, but there are a lot of different reasons to try to take someone's property by force. Was this common banditry? Did they need it for parts? Has Luke vandalized their home and this is their way of exacting revenge? Something that A New Hope does well, and that a lot of the original trilogy does well, that I kind of wish more films would take note of, is that it doesn't bother to explain this to us. Partially because beyond being a plot contrivance, it doesn't matter. But also because A New Hope doesn't desperately try to explain every little thing to you. It has faith in itself and in the audience that as long as what it presents is engaging, interesting, and perhaps most crucially entertaining, that it doesn't need to look you in the eye and say, the Sand People are an oppressed and impoverished group who have taken to violent resistance and see Luke as a colonizer. Instead, the vibe you get, and this isn't an original observation, but I also don't know who I'm borrowing it from, so apologies for that. If you know who it is who came up with this, please tell me, is that A New Hope is like a film that was shot in the Star Wars universe. This makes sense, and the story rolls on as if this is something you should intuitively understand. And we do. Even if we interpret it differently, we get what's happening here. That's not to say that there's no exposition at all in the original trilogy films, but it's just refreshing in comparison to some later installments in the franchise that we will pretend do not exist for now. However, these are constraints that work to make a film good. This wouldn't work if you were making, say, a Dungeons and Dragons style space opera set in the Star Wars universe 4,000 years before the events of the films, which is what KOTOR is. If a D&D dungeon master simply said, yeah, you don't know why these guys just bashed you on the head, and also you don't need to know more about them, you might not want to play with that person again. So let's explore KOTOR, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, and what's possibly one of my favourite quest lines in the game, and make a few comparisons along the way between how KOTOR looks at Tatooine and the Sand People, and how the films treat them in their limited appearances. Yes, I will be talking about Attack of the Clones and possibly the most hilariously acted scene in the prequel trilogy, but trust me, there's something interesting about how that film treats the Sand People and how KOTOR, which was released just over a year later, treats them. Tatooine in the films isn't really that important. It's important in the sense that it's where two important characters are from, and it's the place where Han Solo is kept in carbonite by Jabba the Hutt, but there's nothing inherently interesting or important about it. It's a desert planet with at least one hive of scum and villainy. One of the funnier things that I saw come out of Dune's latest film adaptation is people deliberately baiting others by saying that Dune's Arrakis is a ripoff of Tatooine, which is just top tier trolling. I couldn't really find a source that says Tatooine was definitely 100% inspired by Arrakis, but given George Lucas, like all artists, draw upon inspirations from various sources, I find it believable that it is. I just didn't see George Lucas explicitly. If he said it, right? But I couldn't find it. It's just that where Arrakis has an absolute centrality, being both the most lucrative and most important planet in the Imperium, Tatooine has none of that. Sure, Luke perhaps has a glancing resemblance to the narrative arc of Paul, but if Tatooine is Arrakis, it's Arrakis without the spice and without the Fremen. Luke puts it best himself.
Well, if there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that it's farthest from.
It has no importance, no relevance, no resources. The only commerce or production we see are moisture evaporators, various droid scavenging operations, pod racing, and criminal syndicates. Of course, you can tell interesting stories on a planet with these things, but if you were making an RPG, you'd probably need more of it before you even try to present it to the players. Which brings us to how KOTOR treats Tatooine and what the opportunities of KOTOR were in terms of adapting the Star Wars universe into a game. First, a really quick plot synopsis for KOTOR that'll guide us as we go on. Spoilers, obviously, but the game's like 21 years old, so kind of on you at this point. The story of KOTOR is the story of your character who is retracing their steps, suffering from Force-induced amnesia, to find pieces of a star map that guides you to the giant space factory that the bad guys will use to build a gigantic galaxy-conquering fleet. When you visit the places with the star map, you can't just simply walk up to it and grab it, right? You have to navigate, at times, complicated factional conflicts that usually involve a moral dilemma that determines whether you're walking the path of the light side or the dark side. You know, RPG stuff, but with a mandatory moral judgment at every step because of how George Lucas built the Star Wars galaxy. Tatooine has a piece of the star map, and it's one of your stops on your galaxy-spanning romp. In the year of the game's release, Tatooine was the only planet that had featured in a film that was in the game, and that presents certain challenges, especially when you consider that it's set 4,000 years before the films. To give you a sense of the scale of time we're talking about, 4,000 years ago, woolly mammoths were still walking the earth. So, you know, it's what we would call a long time ago. If we're talking about a series of galaxy-traversing societies interacting with each other, There's no way that Tatooine or any of the people inhabiting it or who inhabited it between these two dates would occupy the same positions and relationships with each other throughout that whole time. So BioWare essentially had a relatively blank slate. They had like the bones of a planet, but they had a pretty blank slate, but they also had some of the pressures of adapting Tatooine to a video game. These pressures were obviously different to making Return of the Jedi the video game. There is no Star Wars film set in this time period, but if we're being honest, going back to Tatooine and not having at least a few, hey, I recognize that, moments would be a tiny bit disappointing. When you have planets like Manaan, Korriban, Kashyyyk, which hadn't been in a film yet, if I'm recalling correctly, to explore in a game, a familiar place helps confirm to us that while things are really different, this is still the same old Star Wars universe and galaxy that we love. So Tatooine has to be both familiar and different, and also have enough depth to actually function as an interesting RPG setting with some pretty big and some small moral choices that push us towards the light or the dark. You know, simple, really. On Tatooine, the only real major player on the planet is Zerka, who appear throughout KOTORs 1 and 2, fulfilling the role of generic, big corporation who's doing a bit of everything, including crime. What are they doing on Tatooine? Well, they're mining ores from the planet. How's that likely to pan out? Well, let's cut to the dialogue provided by one of Zerka's own soundcrawler engineers.
Well, Tatooine fools people. It looks like it might have a good supply of resources, but it doesn't. Before a company learns this, they've already set up communities to support operations they now can't afford. The company pulls out, cities dry up, and after a few years, someone that doesn't know why it failed tries again.
This is actually really an interesting detail. To tip my hand a little about where we're going with all of this, a lot of colonial endeavors were variously abandoned and picked back up over and over again, which can contribute to a determination to be the ones who made it work, either because of the prestige or because the resources you need to find to make certain colonies viable would have to be super lucrative. This is reflected by how little your party knows about the planet. It's very clearly a frontier world. The most notable commentary is how the colony is likely to be abandoned, or that they don't know why Zerka is even bothering. Canderous does give you some information, but truthfully his information is basically the desert is dangerous, which isn't a great social commentary, but it is really good advice, so thanks Canderous. Basically, Tatooine is a nothing world that is occasionally colonized, it seems, and this is done by one corporate entity or another over time. The only other notable player on the planet, at least near the spaceport we land in, are the Sand People, and I'm going to get properly in depth on them in a short while, but the extremely condensed version is they've been attacking Zerka mining operations, and this conflict is your key to getting the permission you need to go into the desert and to sort things out and find your star map. I'd say in a way KOTOR has, by virtue of being an RPG and the depth that's required by being an RPG, given Tatooine its spice and its Fremen. It's just that the spice is apparently a low quality ore that no one really wants, and its Fremen are just a group of people who want their sacred sites to be left alone. Really, they want to be left alone on top of that, as well as their sacred sites. To me, it's really appropriate that we have this weaving of the familiar in the form of the Sand People and Tatooine, alongside these new dynamics like Zerka. Of course, there's also familiar criminal-looking elements, and there's the swoop bikes, which, given the timing of the release of the game, is absolutely a pod racing predecessor. Like, let's be real, this is pod racing. Now, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, big corporations seeking to extract resources versus indigenous group who wants them to just fuck off is pretty obvious as far as a moral dilemma goes on the surface. Like, a galaxy-spanning corporation that has ties to organized crime and is openly working with the Sith is just, like, it's just obviously evil, right? This isn't even the only time that Zerka occupies this kind of role that they do, because this also happens on Kashyyyk, and perhaps there's another video on that another time. But suffice to say that Zerka are bad news. There's a reason why across pop culture, corporations are shorthand for the bad guys, and Zerka really rise to the occasion to provide that to you. The opportunity to both have us sit up and go, hey, I recognize that, as in a typical adaptation, and the chance to tell an interesting, distinct story are both taken here. By necessity, there's more to Tatooine than it being where the Skywalkers are from, because this predates them by 4,000 years. It's a planet whose story is oddly relevant to events that are ongoing at the time of recording, about a colonizing force and colonized people resisting them. This is a good time to explain a relevant mechanic of the game itself. The game comes from an era of RPG where morality is measured, in this case on a scale of light side to dark side, and acts that move you in one direction or another can erase the impacts of earlier acts. That is to say, the Stannis Baratheon concept of the good not washing out the bad, nor the bad the good, does not apply. Sorry to Stannis Baratheon on that one. You can absolutely erase any good you've done in relation to your character's alignment with the Force by just being evil. The other critical thing in the game setting is that in the Star Wars galaxy, the Force is real. When the game judges your character's alignment or you use a light or dark side power, that is, as far as the setting of the game goes, an objective assessment. Yes, you may have used Force Choke to defeat a Sith assassin, but you've still used the Force in an objectively dark side aligned way. In the Star Wars galaxy, and especially in KOTOR, there's the capacity for interesting and complex stories, but when it comes to the Force, it's actually really well defined and really simple. You either do the good thing or you do the bad thing. You solve the problem confronting you or the people who have enlisted your help in a way that aligns you with the light or the dark. It's simple, it's easy to understand, and it can create some interesting commentary on issues that exist in the real world. One example is something that I had honestly forgotten about before my recent playthrough of the game, after maybe more than a decade having not played it, which is that this game is not shy about depicting racism, and it depicts it early in the game. Now, before I really get into the point here, I do want to say that it's kind of funny that so many of a certain type of YouTuber or video game commentator who fixates on these issues, and they say things like, oh, games were great 20 to 30 years ago before they ruined it with, and you can insert your own weird right-wing brain rot that usually means depicting any kind of injustice that makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. If they've played this game, given the generally universal praise of this game, they would probably cite it as a good game from 20 to 30 years ago. Yet it depicts racism, and it's not shy about it. And you could say, oh, but it's different because it's non-humans and humans, so it's not the same thing. But to that, I would say, is dehumanization not a key component of racism? Either way, I'm not really trying to grandstand so much as say this game early on makes quite a bold commentary on Taris, which is that it is a segregated and prejudiced society. I'll give you some examples. When you wake up in an apartment on Taris, it's an apartment building that's apparently been set aside to house non-humans who have been trapped on the planet because of the Sith blockade, to the point that some of the non-humans express surprise that you're even in the building at all. Another is that non-humans who are actually from Taris primarily inhabit the lower levels, which also forms a class distinction, with the lower levels being much poorer and much more neglected than the surface. And I don't really know if you can call it a surface, because the surface should be... Anyway, we're getting sidetracked here. But speaking of the surface, people on there will say really awful things about non-humans, including one who's pretty much an explicit hate preacher who seems to get really mad at you for calling him out, which I guess even the Star Wars galaxy has its alt-right pipeline. The final example, which was a moment that, to be honest, spun me out when I was playing it, is an Ithorian being chased by some children who are attacking him because he's not human, and him calling out to you to help him. This is where the game makes the decision that'll have the weird, bald ape streamers who scream about pronouns really mad. Intervening on his behalf is rewarded with light side points. So there we have it. The Force has made its judgment. Racism is bad. The situation is a really good lead into the main event for this video. The Sand People in KOTOR, because they are very much resisting a dynamic that is similar to the Teresian non-humans forced to live in the Undercity. The Sand People clearly occupy a particular role in this dynamic on Tatooine. They're the indigenous people of the planet, resisting a corporation seeking to extract value from their home, who desecrate their sacred sites. Simple, right? It's made even simpler by the fact that Zerka, in exchange for the hunting license you need to leave Anchorhead, requests that you kill the Sand People and collect their gaffy sticks as proof. I think it's interesting that on the surface, this looks pretty simple, even though the issue it's angling towards is massive. Other YouTubers who have looked at this, and yeah, this is partially a reply to a video by Dark Lord Dash, who made a video about why it's right to kill the Sand People, which partially inspired me to go back to the game, so thanks for that push to go back to the game. That they can come to that conclusion, though, interests me. First of all, no hate on that video. I think it's a sign that KOTOR has really succeeded as an RPG that seeks to present moral dilemmas and measure morality that you can justify any sequence of actions for your character. They did a really good job of making the evil choices at least feel like it's plausibly worth doing. I think the trap a lot of games fall into is that being evil is boring. But in this, it kind of takes the philosophy of Yoda about the dark side being the easy way and implements it. It is easier, in a sense, to just walk into the Sand People's compound and kill them all. Just conceptually, from a video game perspective. Go into place, kill enemies, collect loot. Feels a lot lighter than get a droid who speaks the language, collect a disguise, negotiate with the chief, get the thing the chief wants, peacefully resolve most of the conflict while learning about their culture. One process at least has fewer steps than the other. Now, I'm not saying walking into the Sand People compound and just going Anakin Skywalker on them is easy. It's actually quite difficult, depending on how you're leveled. Now, I think that the video by Dark Lord Dash makes some interesting observation and goes the wrong way with them, but does it in like a believable way for the character. First of all, he makes the argument that the Sand People's chief is a hypocrite because his culture shuns technology while he's asking for technology to allow his people to move away in order to reduce the amount of conflict. I want to bear in mind, and I will substantiate this, and I will try at least, that Zerka is asking you to commit genocide. And the video makes the argument that by killing the storyteller, you sever their connection to the technophobic and xenophobic culture and could allow them to build something better. To which I'd say, remember who you're doing this on behalf of, and you're destroying an entire culture. The hypocrisy argument, I think, misunderstands the processes that might be at play here. Cultures are not stagnant and set in stone. They're more water than stone than we would like to believe. It might feel that way to us living in our culture over a lifetime, but over decades and centuries, things change. Sometimes subtly and sometimes dramatically. You could call their leader a hypocrite, but he might just be steering his people through changes happening because of contact with colonists. I'm not gonna get too deep into the history here, but plenty of indigenous cultures have adopted some aspects of their oppressors' technology and practices in order to resist them. And as part of this change that happens when cultures are in contact with each other, we exchange knowledge and ideas and thoughts. Even with the Sand People, apparently, it's clearly been happening. They live in a heavily defended compound in the desert. Even if you say, okay, he's a hypocrite. Does being a hypocrite mean you must die? Or do your people deserve to die because of you being a hypocrite? It's not explicitly said, but you're killing most of the fighters of his particular group of Sand People if you follow Zerka's orders. Do you think that the women and children are more or less likely to survive in that circumstance? There's also the point that the Sand People have been attacking miners who aren't necessarily armed or directly threatening them, even outside of their sacred grounds. Dark Lord Dash makes a point about them not educating Zerka, to which the obvious report is, why should they educate them? They're interlopers who have arrived uninvited, and we're not really told about the build-up to the conflict in any kind of detailed or objective way, at least so far as I remember. Who's to say that Zerka didn't shoot first? My second point here is that all of this complexity is a pretty good reflection of how conflicts like this have happened in real life. Resistance against colonial forces often involves moral compromises. There's not really such a thing as a perfect victim in any dynamic where there's a victim. Depicting the Sand People as frankly awful in some of the ways they conduct themselves lends them a depth and means that while I think the killing the Sand People is right argument isn't right, it's one I understand people making depending on what parts of the evidence you choose to think is more important. This complexity and depth really contrasts with the film released the year before the game, Attack of the Clones, where the Sand People kidnap Anakin's mum, put her through harsh conditions, and she dies in his arms, causing his first step towards the dark side, as he
killed them all. They're dead. Every single one of them.
Side note here, but Hayden Christensen is really trying his best here with the material he was given, but oh my god, oh my god. That scene just lives rent-free in my head. My point is, the Sand People just seem to be doing things to advance the plot and give Anakin his first big boy dark side moment. And while these two events are 4,000 years apart, meaning there's almost no chance that the Sand People Anakin kills in a fit of rage formed a contiguous culture with the ones you encounter as a player, it is interesting to think about that the Sand People of the late Republic still resist and have to resist colonists, and if the culture of Tatooine is a colonizing one, slaving colonists, I might add. And Anakin's mother may well have just been caught up in that. The difference is primarily one of format. Episode 2 is a film about Anakin. KOTOR's Sand People questline is by necessity about the Sand People, so they could show them as these imperfect resistors of colonialism and give them agency. Like, you can, in spite of all of this, go for Anakin and just kill them all. The problem is, how do you know all of these Sand People are combatants? Not to sound like the exact kind of guy who would say this, but they do all wear the same clothes. You enter their home in a disguise, which I think is a war crime if you're intending to enter combat with them, and you either start blasting or you lead them through negotiations and then turn on them, which I think is also a war crime. Now, I know some of you are going to get real tricky with it and say, how can there be a war crime if there's no war? And you know what I mean. Don't be like that. One of the people you have to kill is the storyteller. Now, I don't agree with much of what Dark Lord Dash says in his video, but he's right in that killing the storyteller will sever their cultural connection to their historic culture. You will in essence be preventing the reproduction of that culture and forcing them to become something else. There's no guarantee, however, that this doesn't end up being something even worse, more militant, more organized, but also what gives you the right to decide that? Is it being a Jedi? Is it the fact that you are asked to do this by a megacorp? The game is clear in the objective reality of the Star Wars galaxy, according to the mechanics of the game, and if you really think about it for a second, siding with Zerka is bad and siding with the Sand People is good. Hello, Editing SK here. I realized during the course of my editing that I actually made a mistake, or at least heavily implied something that's not true. In this script, you probably get the impression that you are explicitly awarded light side points for not killing the Sand People. When you turn in the quest, you don't get light side points for it, though I would argue in the mechanical context of the game, it is still pretty explicit, considering how often HK-47, an explicitly dark side character, keeps requesting that you just start blasting. So, that's it, just a quick clarification. I'll let you get back to the video. The fact that they layer all of this in an interesting way throughout the quest only makes it better and almost more interesting in how the simple moral framework teases all of this out. Star Wars is not a complex morality tale. Part of that is because, frankly, it doesn't need to be morally complex. You can represent complex situations with lots of moving parts and a deep history and still be able to say pretty plainly that this is good and that's bad. Even though I have my issues with RPG games that try to measure or categorize morality explicitly, mostly because I think this way of doing it makes the games worse, in Star Wars, it is a necessary evil, and this is one of two quest lines where they do it really well in this game. One of the reasons why this is so satisfying, as someone who grew up loving the original trilogy, and to be honest, secretly kind of liking the prequels and is glad they got a second wind from meme culture, is this quest line thematically matches what makes the rebels so obviously the good guys. They might be complex, in fact any revolutionary group will be, but they're clearly good. George Lucas made an analogy, has made an analogy with the Viet Cong, and let me tell you, they did some interesting things. Certainly things that would make a lot of liberals today, if they were back then, say, it's complicated. But the simple moral framework recognizes the rebels, Viet Cong, whoever, whatever you want to call them, as good, and it recognizes the Sand People in this situation as good. I think a lot more of the recent Star Wars content has tried to adapt to a more contemporary image of everything needing to be shades of grey. And KOTOR certainly has elements of that. And in some parts of it, it works great. Like, Andor is great for it. Other recent Star Wars media, yeah, not so much. KOTOR's 1 and 2 both do a good job of presenting these delicate, detailed situations, and still definitively and directly telling us what's right and what's wrong according to the laws of that galaxy far, far away. Thanks for watching, everyone. So I need to thank my proofreader, who is my partner, who also contributed to making the excellent costume that I was still wearing at the end of this video. I'm actually sewn into it, so that's great. And I need to thank the thumbnail artist, Molto. You should go check her out. There's a Ko-fi link in the description. Go check her out. Make sure you commission her, or just give her some money. Or give me money, like the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kurzi Scheider, John N, and Liron, as well as the YouTube members Nadir Jiwa, KT Marshall, and Roger Zugi. If you join the Patreon, you will get at least one video a month early. If you're at the higher tiers, you get all of my videos early. If you're a YouTube member, you get all of the videos early. No matter what tier or where you subscribe, you get to vote on the topics of the videos. If you're a top tier subscriber, you get to do things like suggest video topics to me. In fact, everyone kind of gets to do that in their own way. But yeah, if any of that interests you, if you want to basically tell me what to do, there you go. Those are the places where you can do that. On that note, everyone, I will catch you all on the next one, and I have some Jedi that need to be taken care of. So that's I'll get right on that. So everyone, have an excellent Halloween, because this is coming out the week of Halloween. I hope everyone has a good time, and I will catch you on the next one. Take it easy, everyone. Bye bye.